All right, in this video, we're going to take a look at distance, midpoint, and slope. Now, this is going to be a review, so it is going to be a little bit of a longer video, but it's not going to be super long. But if you need to, skip along to see which parts you need. If you have distance on lock, go ahead, work on midpoint or slope. If you need work on midpoint, then skip on that, okay? Or skip to that. Do what you need to from this video. I'm just going to walk through the different ways to do distance, midpoint, and slope, and we're going to look at two of each. We're going to look at a graph one and a math one, okay? So one on a graph and then one with points. So let's take a look. We want to find the distance of this line segment from the graph. Now, if I'm doing this from a graph, what I would encourage you to do is go ahead and make a triangle. So we usually make a right triangle here, so we kind of stay along our lines, and then we'll draw here. All right, at this point, we're going to count up our boxes. I've got 6 boxes on the bottom and 2 on the side. Now notice I have a formula over here on the right side, a squared, b squared, c squared. That is a formula you get on the SOL, so it's a formula you can use, you can have written down before your quiz. All right, so 6 and 2 are my 2 formulas, so I'm going to go ahead and plug those in. So I've got 6 squared plus 2 squared. So if we plug those in, I get 36 plus 4, and that comes out to 40. Now remember, all of this is equal to c squared. So if I'm setting this up, it's equal to c squared. So what I need to do here is I need to take the square root of both sides. So square root of 40 and square root of c squared. So now let's talk about our final answer here. When we're dealing with this, okay, our answers could show up in 2 different ways. One way this answer could show up would be something like this: 2 root 10 is equal to c. So that's equal to square root of 40. Another way that this could show up would be something like 6.4 or 6.3. It's one of those two. It's 6 point some decimal, and it might say choose the closest one. Now, if your answer option looks like a decimal, well, that's really easy. We can just plug square root of 40 into our calculator or Desmos. But what do I do if I have a whole bunch of answer options like this? Say I have 4 root 10, and I've got square root of 20 and a bunch of different options. How do I know what to do if it has a simplified root? Well, what you can always do is you can always plug your answers in. Plug 2 root 10 into your calculator, just like you plugged in root 40. Do they both come out to the same decimal? So if you need to, plug it into your calculator. So that's distance on a graph. That should be really easy. Draw your triangle, a squared, b squared, c squared. So now let's take a look. What if I don't get a graph? What if they're just giving me some points? What do I do? Well, remember, this also is a formula we get. We get this formula right here, x minus a squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. That is a formula we get to have on the formula, or on the test, or on the quiz, I mean, because we have it on the SOL. So how do we use it though? Well, we're going to take the x values and we're going to plug it in for my x values. Okay, so notice I've got an x right here that tells me that's where my x's are going. So I'm going to put negative 3 in here minus negative 7. Now notice there's 2 minus signs. One that comes from the negative 7, one that comes from the minus sign. I always got to include the minus sign in my original formula. Plus, all right, now I'm going to do my 2 y values. So let's switch up the colors here. I've got 1 and 6, so 1 minus 6 is equal to r squared. Now this is just my a squared, b squared, c squared. Instead of doing it on a graph, we're just doing it with points. So negative 3 minus negative 7, that's going to come out to a 4 squared, positive 4 squared, plus 5 squared. This all is equal to r squared, and again, 4 squared plus 5 squared, that's 16 plus 25 is equal to r squared. 16 plus 25 is 41. So actually this comes out to very similar, very close to what our last problem came out to. And so that's probably going to come out to something like 6.5 is probably what that comes out to be. All right, 6.4, 6.5, somewhere in that range. All right, so there's distance. Let's move on to midpoint. Now, this is one that we haven't quite looked at yet. When we want to find midpoint on a graph, there's kind of 2 ways to think about it. One way is just to go ahead and take the line like this and say, what looks like, what's let's do it this way first, actually. What are the 2 points here? Well, this here is -1, -1. That's the point. Over here is 2, 4, 5, 6, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is -5, +5. So maybe not great choices for me for these values, but we're going to keep moving forward. So, sorry, I'm just making lots of mistakes here. Okay, -5, +5, not a plus sign in between. All right, so those are my 2 values. So now I want to find the midpoint. Well, this is just like if I was doing it the math way with the formula. I'm going to add up my x's on one side, 5 plus -1 all over 2, and I'm going to add up my y's, 5 plus -1 all over 2. All right, so that comes out to -3, and that comes out to +2. So my final answer here would be -3, +2. Now, if you have to type in your answer, it's important that you get all of these pieces. It's a point, so that means I need to get both parentheses and the comma. If you don't get those, it doesn't count as a point. So you need to do parentheses, num x value, comma, y value, parentheses. So make sure you get the whole thing. Now, here's another way we could solve this. What if we just look at the graph? What looks like the middle point on this line? Let's take a look. Well, here's an endpoint, there's an endpoint. It looks like this right here looks a whole lot like the midpoint of my line. And then what point is that on my graph? Well, look, believe it or not, that's -3, +2. So if you want, on a graph, you can actually sometimes just look at the graph and tell what the midpoint is, especially if you're given multiple options. You can always plot the other midpoints and then see which one is your midpoint. All right, so that's midpoint on a graph. Let's look at midpoint with the formula, which we already did a little bit, but let's take a look real quick. We'll do this quickly. 4 plus -3 over 2, comma, 0 plus 6 all over 2. 4 plus -3 is 1, so that's 1/2. 6 plus 0 is 6, divided by 2 is 3. My final answer here is 1/2, comma, 3. We add the x's together, we add the y's together, we divide both by 2, and we get our final answer. All right, so we've done distance, we've done midpoint. Now it's time for slope. So let's find slope on this graph. So if we're doing slope from a graph, the first thing we want to do is we want to find a point that crosses on our graph nicely. So as we're looking along this line, hopefully we found one. This right here looks like a great point. Crosses on my graph. I've got a vertical and a horizontal. I've got a point right there. Thumbs up. The next thing I want to do is I want to find the next closest point. It doesn't matter if I go to the right or to the left. I'm going to go ahead and go to the left here and see if I can trace this line down until I find another good point. Oh, there's one right there. All right. So there's my 2 points. Okay. Now, once again, just like distance, we're going to do our triangle. Here's our rise and run. So a rise of 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or you could think of this as a rise of -1 since we're going down. And remember, slope is rise over run. So let's go ahead and plug these guys in. Rise over run, 1 over 5. Now look, is this going uphill or downhill? As I go left to right, it's going downhill. So that makes this a -1 or a -1/5. So my slope here would be -1/5, a real gentle downhill. All right, last problem. Let's find the slope here of 5, 4, and between 5, 4 and 4, -2. All right, so remember we're going to subtract our y's here. So y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. Now if you do some formulas have it y1 minus y2, x1 minus x2. That works, that's okay. Just so long we get the y values on the top, the x values on the bottom, and they're in the same order. If we go with the first ones first, great. If we go with the second ones first, that's fine too. Just keep them in the same order. You can't like flip-flop them. All right, so let's plug it in here. This is an x and a y. This is my first pair. This is my x and y of my second pair. So -2 minus 4 on the top, 1 minus 5 on the bottom. So this is -6 over -4, which we know could be +6 or +4. When we get a slope, we should always check to see. If it's not on the graph, we should check. If it's on a graph, we check and see if it's positive or negative. If it's not on the graph, we need to check and make sure that we've reduced it as far as we can. This one can reduce. I can divide top and bottom by 2. So make sure you're reducing these, and this comes out to 3 over 2. Just as a quick reminder, if we ever get a 0 in the denominator, that's undefined. If we get a 0 in the numerator, then it's just a 0 slope. All right, so this wraps up our review for distance, midpoint, and slope. Hopefully that was helpful. And if you have any questions, always feel free to email me. Good luck, study hard, and do well on the practice and then on the quiz.